Well, good morning, and once again, we are thankful for the opportunity to be here to worship the Lord together this morning, and as well for those of you who are online, and especially those of you who might be with us this morning as guests. We want to say welcome, and we trust that your time will be of benefit and encouragement. We continue on this morning in our series, Navigate Direction for Difficult Days, as we unpack a variety of truths from the book of Proverbs. And this morning we see a very pertinent topic that is incredibly important for us in our desire to have lives that matter. And that is in the truth that friends are influential. Ron Hutchcraft recounts this story whereby in 1963 the United States Supreme Court outlawed prayer in America's public schools. One of the plaintiffs in that case was America's best known and most visible atheist at the time, Madalyn Murray O'Hair. Over the years, she was a vocal proponent of atheism and an aggressive campaigner against religion in public life. Then one day, she vanished, leaving her sports car in an airport parking lot and $500,000 missing from the American Atheist Association bank account. The Internal Revenue Service seized Mrs. O'Hair's home to pay her creditors and some back taxes. And one of the items at auction was her diaries. And one entry said, "The whole idiotic hopelessness of human relations descends upon me. Tonight I cried and cried, but even then, feeling nothing." Then Hutchcraft reports how he was struck by 4 words that Madalyn Murray O'Hair wrote at least half a dozen times in her diary. "Somebody, somewhere, please love me." The human heart longs for the friendship of an unlosable love. And just as it was with Madalyn Murray O'Hair, the world is filled with lonely people. Some observers have called loneliness the most pervasive and important problem of this current century. Why is it? Why is it that loneliness and the need for friendship are such universal problems? Years ago, a songwriter penned these words, "People who need people are the luckiest people in the world." The truth is, they are the only people in the world. God created us for companionship with Himself and others, but now, due to the entrance of sin, we not only turned away from God, but we've also turned away from one another. And this morning, if you might be even here in a state of singleness, let me encourage you in this fact. Marriage is not the panacea for loneliness. Unfortunately, I know many married individuals who are very, very lonely. It is not surprising that we often struggle with our relationships. And many of us struggle with constant anxiety about our friendships, who we should be friends with, how many friends we don't have, and the depth or shallowness of all of those relationships. Well, the writer of Proverbs fully understood the priority and the power and the place of friendships and what they would hold in the life of his child. And he knew just how influential those relationships would be. And so here what we discover in this great book, with dogged determination, he takes advantage of every teachable moment to equip his child with relational insight and discernment. And throughout this book, no less than 19 times, he uses the word friend or friendship in his attempt to impress upon his child the need to pursue excellence in those relationships that even today we call friends. Well, today what we're going to do is unpack certain facts of friendship that we see revealed in the book of Proverbs that not only were relevant for the day in which they were written, but they continue to be timeless for us today. And you can see there in chapter 12, verse 26, the righteous should choose his friends carefully, for the way of the wicked leads them astray. Well, first up, what we see here in light of these facts of friendship is this truth, is that we need to avoid foolish friends. Avoid foolish friends. 13:20 says this, "He who walks with wise men will be wise, but the companion of fools doesn't have a bright outlook. The companion of fools will be destroyed." See, the point simply is this, bad friends are bad decisions. And the dad here in writing the book of Proverbs is so convicted of this and so consumed with this that right off of the bat in the book of Proverbs, starting in chapter 1, verse 8, after his introduction, he is all about impressing this on his child, where he says this, "My son, if sinners entice you." I've shared how my father, praise God, when I was younger, encouraged me to read the book of Proverbs. And I will never forget in my little juvenile mind, reading the book of Proverbs and being captivated by chapter 1, starting in verse 8 there, where he talks about, "My son, if sinners entice you." And he talks about all the ways that wrong friends will lead you astray. And I remember how that became the matrix upon which I had to navigate my world at that day. And for me, it was sitting in band, as I had a guy on this side of me and a guy on this side of me who did their best to influence me in ways that weren't God-honoring. And listen, young people, I want to encourage you that this is absolutely important for you. And if you have a mom and dad who is encouraging you to make sure you make wise friends, again, you need to thank your lucky stars, because this is absolutely so critical. Because listen, kids, there are adults here right now who are saying in their hearts, "Man, if only I had someone telling me this when I was a young person, because I did not realize that, and in the course of my earlier years, I made poor choices with poor friends, and because of that, it resulted in consequences in my life that I still feel today." Well, what we see here is this truth, that there is a direct correlation, a direct connection between the friends that you choose and whether or not your life is going to flourish or flounder. You see, we are constantly consuming the voices and the lifestyles around us, and the same is true for us as adults too. We are still being influenced all the time by the people and voices that we have around us substantially affect us. And so what we need to do is track what we see in the book of Proverbs as the dad is teaching his son, "Hey, kid, here's how you can spot a bad friend a mile away." Now, some of you might be saying, "Well, listen, that kind of sounds like you're judging. I mean, we shouldn't judge." Listen, people say, "Judge not, lest ye be judged." That is the most misinterpreted verse in all of the scriptures, taken out of context. Because what judging is looking at someone down your nose as you're superior and better than them. That's entirely different than your need to be open in your mind and discerning with your eyes as to what is best and what is not best. And so here's what the dad is telling his son here in light of equipping him for the right kind of relationships. How can you spot a bad friend a mile away? Well, here's one thing. They're a hothead. They're a hothead. Look at Proverbs chapter 22, and there's a lot of passages that articulate this in verse 24 and 25. "Do not make friends with a hot-tempered person. Do not associate with one easily angered, or you may learn their ways and get yourself ensnared." 2 weeks from today, I'll be preaching on this topic of anger. And this is an area in my own life where I have struggled with, especially earlier on in my marriage and in my, parenting, frankly. And I think back in situations where I'm embarrassed at how emotionally immature I was in explosive anger, in ways that I did not handle things well, that were challenging, And for me, it was one of the hard seasons. Holiday time, and if there's one area earlier on where my wife and I butted heads, it was with that, because she's always much more giving and generous than I have been in those earlier days. And man, I remember one time where I slammed the door so hard it shook the whole house, And I'll tell you what, God over the course of the time had to take me to the woodshed and convict me of that and just get that out of my life, because one of the things that I was concerned with was that I was going to be teaching my children a good example of a bad example of what it looks like to be a hothead. Listen, let me encourage you with reference to this matter of not only anger in your own life, but anger in the choice of relationships, because more is caught than taught when it comes to this matter of character. Well, there's a lot more we said about that, and we'll save that for 2 weeks, but that's just one indicator of somebody that you need to be very cautious about. How else can you spot a bad friend a mile away? Well, they're undependable. Note there in chapter 25, verse 19, trusting unfaithful people when you are in trouble is like eating with a broken tooth or walking with a crippled foot. That almost hurts just reading that. I mean, do you ever have a broken tooth and just, oh man, how just disturbing that is? Or if you've ever sprained your ankle, that can be worse than a break. I mean, you're trusting in those things to hold you up, to facilitate what they need to accomplish, but they're just letting you down. Well, that's exactly a mark of a poor friend. They're not responsible. They're just constantly leaving people in the lurch as it pertains to their dependency upon you. And that's a good question that we need to ask ourselves. Man, am I like that? Do I say one thing and never follow through? Are people always up in the air about what's going on with me? Well, they're undependable. Note also what we see here along these lines is spotting a bad friend a mile away reveals the fact that these people are users. Again, there's multiple verses in Proverbs that echo this truth, but in chapter 19, verse 4 through 7, wealth attracts many friends, but even the closest friend of the poor person deserts them. Many curry favor with a ruler, and everyone is the friend of one who gives gifts. The poor are shunned by all their relatives. How much more do their friends avoid them? Though the poor pursue them with pleading, they are nowhere to be found. They're just fair weather friends. They're in it for gain, in it for what you can get out of the relationship. When I was a kid growing up, for a good period of time, I was just really into motorcycles and mini bikes and stuff, and I was never allowed to have one. And so some of my best friends were kids that had them, so that I could ride these mini bikes and stuff. And I'll never forget this one situation where I was friends with this one guy, and then we just kind of drifted apart for a period of time. But then he got a Honda 125 dirt bike. Brand spanking new. That was the coolest bike. Guess who all of a sudden was right there with him as a good friend? Me. I was a user. Now, I'm not proud to say that story, but it's very easy to view relationships with that. And it's one thing as a junior high or whatever with that mindset of immaturity and selfishness, but you know what? It's a whole nother thing that when in a marriage even, you're just a user. The only time that you're nice is when you want something. and the other person sees it coming a mile away, because it's nothing other than selfish manipulation. Trait of a bad friend. Note also here how to spot a bad friend a mile away. They're socially brain dead. I coined that from right here because of how illustrative and how blunt this statement is in chapter 27, verse 14. He who blesses his friend with a loud voice, rising early in the morning. We all know what that's like. When we're just waking up and somebody just is totally insensitive to us in that state, and that rude intrusion, it'll be accounted a curse to him. And in essence, what this is indicative of the fact is that it's illustrative of a life that is simply insensitive to other people. You see, they are the center of their universe. And it doesn't matter what anybody else is about or whatever, because you're secondary on the global map of what's important. Everything revolves around them, and they're clueless because they are excessively self-absorbed. You need to watch out. Finally, in light of this, and this is really just a sampling, these 5 are just a sampling of many more that we could have that are illustrative through the book here, is this: their arrogance spills out when they are corrected. There's a lot to be said in Proverbs about discerning pride in other people's lives, our lives as well. And again, multiple verses illustrate this, but 9, 7, and 8 says this: if you rebuke a mocker, you will only get a smart retort. Yes, he will snarl at you. So don't bother with him. He will only hate you for trying to help him. But a wise man, when rebuked, he will love you all the more. See, pride is both blinding and delusional. And so how you know an individual is somebody that you need to be very cautious with is that when you try to help them, when you try to encourage them, man, they just snap at you. What's that indicative of? It's indicative of hidden arrogance and pride that is so blinding to us and so easy for us to rationalize away. Well, those are some negative truths that we need to avoid, that we need to be discerning of in the selection of friendships. But another fact of friendship is not only do we need to avoid foolish friends, but what we need to do, we need to find wise friends. And note there, the same verse that we use for foolish friends, because there's a contrast here in chapter 13:20. He who walks with wise men will be wise. And so you need to associate with, you need to be around these kind of people. See, the goal of friendship isn't simply to avoid others' foolishness, but it's to avoid our own. And for us to be able to avoid our own foolishness, we must have people who are going to be honest with us. And so in contrast to foolish friends, let's look at this. Let's look at the fact that you found a good friend when you have someone who lives out and carries themselves with these kind of truths. You know you found a good friend here, first of all, when they tell you what you need to hear, not necessarily what you want to hear. That's a mark of a good friend. Where do we see that? Chapter 27, 5 and 6. Open rebuke is better than love carefully concealed. Faithful are the wounds of a friend, but the kisses of an enemy are deceitful. Very profound verse right there in light of the fact that, a failure to correct, a failure to rebuke is a failure to love. Because a failure to rebuke an individual that you do love says this: I love myself and my own comfort more than I love you, to make myself feel uncomfortable about your need to have an issue adjusted in your life. And faithful are the wounds of a friend. See, it's a scalpel performing surgery, cutting out infection that needs to be removed. However, what's the mark of an enemy? A mark of an enemy is He just constantly is telling you things that make you feel good about yourself and leave you just as you are. I like chapter 27, verse 9, ointment and perfume delight the heart, and the sweetness of a man's friend gives delight by hearty counsel. I've shared this before. We have something, I got something on my dresser that my grandkids know as man stink. And man stink stems from my dad, always growing up, he wore Menon aftershave lotion, a green Menon aftershave lotion. And when my dad passed away, he had a brand new bottle of it on his dresser. So I took it. He wasn't going to be using it anymore. And so I took it home, and I still got that same bottle. He's been dead now for close to 10 years. Mom's going to correct me when I see her here. Well, how many? Okay, almost 13 years. And I still got that on because I only use it Saturday mornings. I only put it on Saturday mornings to remind me of my dad and just say, thanks God for a good dad that he was to me. It's that aroma of it. Well, in the course of time, you know how grandkids and kids they'll follow you into your bedroom and you're getting ready and so forth. And so I just started this thing with the kids when they were little. Hey, you want some man stink? And they say, yeah. And so I said, okay, this is how you do it. And so I first I do it myself. I pour some in my hand and then I slap their face with it. Like they're like, like this. I said, okay, now you do it. And I put them in their hands. I said, this is how you got to do it. And I really make them slap their face. I don't know why, but I do. And they do it. They smack their face. So every time they'll come over and they'll say, hey, can I have some man stink? And I say, yeah. And so we'll go in my bedroom. We'll give them some man stink. And they slap it on. And when they do, it's like, it just like it invigorates them, and it puts some zip in their step. There's nothing like man stink. See, that's exactly what hearty counsel does in friendship. Man, it gives them needed energy in their life as you give them some discernment, as you help them see things and waken up to areas that they weren't really aware of that they had need of. Well, not only do we see that here in light of these marks of a good friend, but their influence. What does their influence do? Their influence makes you a better person. That's what it results in. Chapter 12, verse 18, the first part of it, I've read Proverbs my entire life, but it wasn't until about 8 years ago that this really was driven home to me, where it says, the words of the reckless pierce like swords, but the tongue of the wise brings healing. The words of the reckless pierce. I received a phone call about 8 years ago that was intentional in its motive to set me straight. And I experienced a verbal tongue lashing in that phone call like I had never experienced in my life. And it just left me bleeding all over the place. And it was like, all kinds of stuff. And then right after I went through that experience, I was like kind of wounded. I read this verse, and it's like, man, isn't that true? Isn't that true? When you have someone who just does nothing other than want to wound you with their words, it leaves you in that state. But note there in chapter 27, verse 17, as iron sharpens iron, so a man sharpens the countenance of his friend. You see, wise people have the gift of tactfulness with their words. It's one thing to say this to your wife. It's one thing to say, honey, your face makes the hands of time stand still. Versus, honey, you have a face that can stop a clock. Yeah? Thank you. It's just tact. There's the good way to say something, there's the bad way to say something. And a good friend has that grace of being able to, put it out there in a way that you get it and is healing ultimately in its result. Well, we also see this, you've found a good friend when they weather your storms with you. They weather your storms with you. Look at chapter 17. A friend loves you all the time, and a brother helps in time of trouble. Yeah, there's nothing like that kind of a person. They're not fair weather friends. They realize you're not the fourth person of the Trinity. They're not expecting perfection from you. And they have the gift of grace to be able to reach down into the pit when you're there and help pull you out. They're with you through those times of trouble. We also see this. They resolve an issue with you and then bury it. Proverbs 10, verse 12, hatred stirs up conflict. But what does love do? Love covers all wrongs. He who covers a transgression seeks love, but he who repeats a matter separates friends. This is not saying that you gloss over sin. That's not what this is saying when it says covers. In essence, it's a synonym for forgives from the standpoint of you don't bring it up again and re-expose the individual with its ugliness. I've shared this story before, but when I was a little kid, we were at my grandparents' in Bellwood, Pennsylvania, and a friend of my grandfather's came over, and I don't know if my grandfather was with him or whatnot, but anyways, they shot a groundhog. And so they shot this groundhog, and they brought this dead groundhog, and they showed it to us kids and stuff, and I'd never seen anything like that. And then they buried it in the back by the railroad bed behind their house there. Well, and then they were visiting on the porch. Well, I was just little, and I was just so intrigued with that thing that I went back out there to where they buried it and dug it up, and then I brought it out to them. And I remember holding this dead groundhog and saying, look what I found. Like it was novel that I really did find this thing, Look what I found. I remember they were repulsed, like, get that thing back. They came over and they took it and, reburied it. Don't do that, stuff. But I was just like, I was just naive and simple and intrigued with bringing up something that needed to stay buried. One of the marks of emotional maturity is the ability to deal with something and then leave it there, and not keep bringing its ugliness back up to reaccuse or to have spiritual show and tell as to this person's failure again and again and again. No, a good friend buries things that are forgiven. Well, we also see this truth is that you found a good friend when they model compelling core values. I love 22:11. One who loves a pure heart and who speaks with grace will have the king as a friend. See, it's that kind of character that causes you, when you see and you meet that kind of person, to say, man, I need to be that kind of person. I want to be like that. I need to be a person that has that kind of heart. I need to be that kind of person that speaks with that kind of grace. They model compelling core values. Well, as we continue to track through Proverbs here, a third fact of friendship that we see is simply this. Not only do we need to avoid foolish friends, not only do we need to find wise friends, but what we need to do is make sure we have the best friend. And notice I did not say have a best friend. We oftentimes say, if I only had a best friend. Listen, best friends are nothing like the best friend. And we see in Proverbs chapter 18:22 this profound statement, one who has unreliable friends soon comes to ruin. But there is a friend who sticks closer than a brother. And we know those kinds of relationships are very rare in the course of life, but there is one best friend. There is one who is the best friend. And we meet him in the New Testament. And fascinatingly, in the Gospels, John chapter 15 is the only passage where Jesus speaks in depth about friendship. And what we see in John chapter 15, verse 12 through 17, is how Jesus commands those who are followers and those who are abiding in him to move into relationships. And what this passage is, it's a sandwich where at the beginning it is marked by the need to love one another, and then it's culminated in the conclusion of the need to love one another. And in the middle is the meat of this sandwich, in which we see the fact that Jesus' love and his friendship is positively transforming in its effect and influence in people's lives. And note what we read him saying here. My command is this: love each other as I have loved you. Greater love has no one than this, to lay down one's life for one's friends. You are my friends if you do what I command. I no longer call you servants, because a servant does not know his master's business. Instead, I have called you friends. For everything that I learned from my Father I have made known to you. You did not choose me, but I chose you and appointed you so that you might go and bear fruit that will last, and so that whatever you ask in my name, the Father will give you. This is my command: love one another. You see, here we see the extent of Jesus' friendship is his sacrificial love. The effect of his friendship is change from the inside out. And the expression of his friendship is one of intimacy and relationship. And the initiative of his friendship is his loving choice to those who do not deserve it. And the goal of this relationship, the goal of his friendship, is enduring fruitfulness, is enduring benefit in your life. And now these characteristics of his love for us are to become the characteristic of our friendship with others. And so that truth forces us to reflect on some very penetrating questions. So let's look at these questions and think about our own journey in this matter of friendship, and here's several of them. What are the limits to your friendships? Do you use people, or do you lay down your life for them? You know, how much do I know of sacrificial love? I do a fair amount of counseling here, and I counsel men over the course of time. And oftentimes in those sessions, it's with reference to marital relationships and things along those lines. And so, you know, I hear the story, I hear the scenarios, I hear the difficulty, and as I'm listening to all of this and finally have the opportunity to speak, oftentimes, you know, counseling really isn't that difficult, because really, simplistically, for myself as well, that am married to a spouse that has a whole lot of flaws, who has a spouse who has a whole lot of flaws. And what I oftentimes share with these situations is, frankly, the journey of my own heart, where I hear them loud and clear, and I say, man, I hear you, I know exactly what you're saying. But you know what I also know, and one of the learning curves of my own life is as a husband, I really only have one option here in light of what I have to do. Ephesians chapter 5 tells me this in light of what I've signed up for in marriage. Here's what my job description is: love my wife as Jesus loved me. Period, end of discussion. That keeps me pretty busy. And in all those irritants and on all those situations and difficulties of relational encounter, I have to keep working hard at disciplining my mind to, you know what, here's my job right now. I need to be Jesus to her. I need to be Jesus to her. That's what it doesn't matter what she's doing right now. That is totally off the table right now. What matters right now is my responsibility to love her as Jesus has loved me. You know what? That will solve a whole lot of relational fracture if we would all be embracing and growing in that simple, freeing, profound, beautiful truth. Well, what other questions we need to ask ourselves? Well, what is my impact on others? Am I a change agent for godliness in my friend's life? You know, am I truly having an impact in light of them seeing the substance of a life well lived? Are they more of a Christ follower because of me? Am I giving myself away in such a way that God-given needs are being met in other people's lives? Who would say yes to that question as they reflect back on my influence? Would my wife say that? Would my children say that? Would my coworkers say that? Do I take the risk of openness, or is there a carefully constructed wall around my life that no one can penetrate? I've been hearing a variety of wonderful reports from our community groups, and just how, even though we're just brand new at this, with the multiple times that we've met, just the level of relational dialogue that is taking place that is so healthy and so transparent and good and positive ways, whereby people are learning and growing in what biblical friendship is all about. Am I an initiator of love, or am I waiting for others to earn my approval to reach out to me? You know, do I choose people as friends because of my needs or because of their needs? And I'm thankful. Dr. Wendell Kempton is no stranger to our ministry. He's with the Lord now, and he visited us a couple of times back in years gone by. But you know, he was an individual who greatly impacted my life by an individual who had significant spheres of influence in the course of his life and in the world, and yet he took an interest in me, of all people. And even one time took my wife and I and several other pastors of churches, you know, treated us to a week of vacation in Nantucket. It's like, what? Like, me? Like, I'm nobody. I can't believe it. What an illustration of taking the initiative to care and show love to someone in friendship. How am I helping my friend realize their potential? You know, are those in the sphere of your influence right now flourishing, or are they floundering? I like what Alistair Begg said: you will never have a better friend than a friend who points you to Christ. Be that friend. And perhaps maybe even this morning, you might even be here, you might even be watching, wherein the cry of your heart is this: would somebody, somewhere, please love me? And this morning, let me remind you of the truth that someone already has. For God so loved you, that he gave his only begotten Son, that whosoever believes in him should not perish, but have everlasting life. And perhaps maybe this morning, the reason why you are missing that love is because you have pushed God out of your life and you have lived your life your way rather than His way. And your simple need this morning, no matter how many steps away from God you might be, it only takes one step back, and that is to turn and to repent and to cry out to Jesus to rescue you from your sin. And what He says is, I will make you my friend. And that friendship is not just influential, it's eternally transforming. Let's pray. Father, thank you for the truth from the book of Proverbs that gives us clarity for how we can discern relationships and what we need to be like in our relationships. And I pray, Father, that we would all the more embrace and live out the pattern of your Son, Jesus Christ, who loved us sacrificially and extensively, has loved us with an everlasting love. Father, we pray that in this new season of opportunity called today, that we would live out these truths and that we would grow in them and live them even better tomorrow and the next day and the next day, so that our lives will be positively influential for the cause of eternity and the glory of your Son, Jesus Christ, who is all about transforming people from the inside out. Bless us with that truth, we ask. In Jesus' name, amen. Well, thank you once again for coming. And as we say regularly here, we always have an open invitation. We don't know where you are in your spiritual journey. And even if you might be with us online this morning, we'd love to hear from you. And if we can help you in any way, please don't hesitate to touch base along those lines. So thanks so much for coming. You're dismissed.